Okay, so let me press the magic buttons and move on to the next part of the day. We've got our next panel sponsor coming up to take us into Mark's first session. And while I get Mark ready, let me just ask if Nino would talk to your panel sponsor slide. Nino, are you there?
I'm here.
Brilliant. Let me put the slide up for you. And while you make the introduction, I'll give Mark a quiet kick under the table. Go ahead, Nino. Tell us about Tulix.
Sure. Tulix is a fully managed streaming service provider with its own infrastructure, which makes solution flexible and cost-effective. Our services include channel orientation, live 24/7 streaming, encoding, transcoding, CDN, distribution, and then custom streaming services. We work with broadcasters and content owners, startups, and just about everybody who needs streaming.
So right now, the important thing next is to see if we can get Mark online. Mark, are you there?
Of course I am.
Good. Okay, I'm going to hand the floor to you. We've got ourselves across the seabed. We've got into the cable landing station. Let's continue the journey. Where's that IP going? Over to you, Mark.
Yes, thank you. Good. I have 3 people on the panel. Nino from Tulix, Ryan from Millicast, and Guy from Lumen. If I can ask all of you 3 just to give a very short elevator pitch about yourself, your position, and what your company does, just to give you a little context for everybody here. Guy, can you start?
Yeah, sure. My name's Guy Tall, and I work as a senior director at Lumen in the CDN team, product team. And Lumen is, one of the largest telco infrastructure companies in the world. We have ISP, voice, moving up to carrier function, IP, of course, VPN, security, SD-WAN, everything VPN you could think of. And then we're also content as well. So we operate one of the largest CDNs in the world, and we're launching edge products as well.
Perfect. Good. Nino, I mean, you gave a little pitch, but give a little bit about your position.
Sure. Nino Doijashvili with Tulix, and we do custom streaming solutions, fully managed. And my role is a business development, and I work across the industry with many vendors, with customers, with prospects, technically coming up with cutting edge solutions. We've been doing that for the last 14 years. When we were streaming, there was just nobody was streaming except maybe churches and international channels. And then I'm very happy to be in the industry. Very interesting, like it would be CDN or a content origination, distributing globally. So all that, and I'm very happy to be on this panel with you together. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. Good. Ryan.
Hi, everyone. Ryan Jesperson. I've been in the streaming industry for almost 20 years, digital video and streaming, and was at Wowzer for over 5 years. Many of you may know me from my time there. Was a customer of many CDNs over the years, whether it's jobs I had at HP or Siemens, building kind of video distribution networks on top of CDNs, including Wowzer. And now my newest ventures, I've been really focused on WebRTC for the last 3-4 years since I left Wowzer. And we've built a WebRTC CDN that kind of replaces the Origin Edge RTMP network for point-to-point, and mass distribution of content sub 500 milliseconds. So our focus is really on that kind of ultra low latency space in building that. And now it's going more from that one to many to actually doing some to many, many to many use cases as well, using WebRTC as a base technology.
Perfect. Great. Guy, I'll start off with you. You recently had the NANOC, and you announced the new peer policy of Lumen, especially in regards to the US and EMEA. Could you tell a bit of reasoning behind the change of that policy that you're looking at? And has that to do with the fact that everything is getting more distributed as such?
Oh, 100%. I mean, the policy change was to accommodate and to help facilitate deeper interconnection with everybody that connects through the IP network. So we have ISPs and and other carriers, content providers that been connecting with us in a couple dozen markets. But when you think globally, that's not actually that many. That's kind of the base, what I call tier 1 interconnection markets. And so behind the scenes, we've been already reaching out to our peering partners and interconnecting deeper with each other. But the idea about announcing it, kind of formally, and I gave the reasoning behind it and all of the data, well, most of the data, was to show the reasoning behind it and why it's important. And yeah, it was received really well. Actually, I was expecting some people to get up to the mic and make some snarky comments, and I got a few of those later. But for the most part, and especially most importantly with our peering partners, they immediately came up to me afterwards and said, "Yes, we're on board. It makes 100% sense. Let's start interconnecting with each other deeper." So we have a couple dozen very large customers as well. But to put it in perspective, our largest peers, our largest customers, all connect to us in 3-4 dozen markets globally. So we're just kind of catching up policy-wise to help push the deeper interconnection with everyone, as that becomes critical to the next generation of apps and streaming that sits on top of IP.
So it's basically following the market trend of lower latency, more reliability, basically these kind of things that are happening in the market right now.
Absolutely.
Perfect. That's a good bridge to Nino. You're really on the distribution side of things. You do a lot with content providers, satellite, IP. You see a shift going on from satellite to IP using SRT, RISC, 6E, all kinds of different methods. RTMP still, WebRTC as well. So you do a lot on the IP networks with point-to-point, which of course then is based on IP infrastructures. What are the typical issues that you still see in that happening right now, where you think, okay, that still is work to be done in that area? And where do you think satellites, which is still an option for certain use cases?
Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting subject, and then I don't see that it's 100% switching one way or another. So what we see, I think IP distribution point-to-point is really beneficial for the content distributors, and because it adds flexibility, it adds scalability and geo-personalization, which is a big point right now. Issues can be on some rural places, like an economic situation, which could be some hurdle, because if you want to distribute content to thousands of points, and economics could be pretty high. And then also some rural places where internet connection would not be very good. So I think that's kind of would be a hurdles right now for IP point-to-point distribution. But again, because of the benefits are so high, I think industry will work toward making that happen. And we work with the broadcasters and everybody actually who needs such distribution, and then customizing those solutions could be bundled together with satellite or and any other services. And again, to make this personalization, adding metadata or changing protocols or whatnot, it's a huge benefit in today's world.
Good. Ryan, I mean, if you dive a little deeper in this into the WebRTC contribution area, right? You're basically fully relying on IP. There's no satellite alternative in that regard. So how do you cope with, let's say, the challenges that Nino is describing on low capacity areas and those kind of areas?
Yeah, I think these panels are great, and these sessions are great to kind of talk about trends that are happening in industry, and we share them across a variety of different circles, right, between all the different places that we're at, whether it's network, whether it's web, whether it's broadcast, and the intersection of all three of those worlds. I think the major trend that's going on right now is the majority of people out in the world are trying to do professional grade workflows on consumer grade equipment and internet connection. The web browser has become the primary way we consume content, and not just content that's user generated. I'm talking about really high high-end content that can be used to replace TV headends and satellite workflows and so on. Especially with the quality or the quantity of content we have, when you try to mix that with the cost and the price of doing that over satellite, in addition to the fact that people want to move into synchronous editing and synchronous cloud switching and use really the web browser and the internet as a way to actually switch what traditionally has been done in broadcast workflows. I think that's the major trend that I've seen with the pandemic and what's happened lately. You know, one of our primary customer bases is Hollywood, you know, and the production of TV shows and movies and so on, both on the production side as well as the post-production side. People want to collaborate in real time as they're doing this all from different corners of the world. IP is really the only solution that will enable those workflows of the future. Satellite is really way behind on that. And I think from a protocol perspective, I think it's great to have, there's a ton of good, reliable contribution protocols, but what people really want is point-to-point. And be able to do that, there really is only one protocol that I see in the industry that enables that through with a web native workflow and is actually ratified by the IETF and the W3C, the two big bodies that regulate the internet. And that's WebRTC. So it's not just a contribution issue, it's also a distribution issue. And that two-way interactivity needs to be enabled with a protocol that can support it.
Good. Guy, I mean, you're a network provider, so I assume you work with SLAs with customers on using IP as a baseline. How do you handle this kind of requests and making sure that you use certain levels of SLAs on what kind of grade of security or grade of reliability they want?
Yeah, we support the SLAs through efficient capacity management and planning. We have built into our agreements with our peering partners that once a circuit hits a certain utilization threshold, that it triggers automatic discussion, and unless there's some reason, long-term cable cut, whatever, that those augments go into place fairly seamlessly. So we manage it on that half of the IP through peering, through the contracts, and then on the other side, we have many customers as well that consume IP, and we have a little bit less control over that. Ultimately the buying decision is up to the customer, but we have proactive account teams that review quarterly with their customers, the trends and where it makes sense to turn up new capacity, and we look at all of that through our NetFlow product or tool rather, just to keep on top of it and keep everything running smoothly. Even with the crazy pandemic times of last year and this year, we've had actually decreasing amount of congested circuits that even during the largest transfer periods, usually initiated by some sort of like download event for one of our CDN customers, but really for any sort of collaboration tool, we've had very, very low saturation, which is our goal. Cool.
I mean, this is also similar to my next question with Ryan, actually. Ryan, you do a lot of ultra low latency, right? Below 500 milliseconds. You do this with your own networks, your own strategic locations, but you're still relying on the IP connectivity to the end user in the end. Especially if you want to do, if you're relying on low latency capabilities and the capacity is part of it. How do you handle the bigger events if you want to do mass distribution, knowing that basically you can't really do caching, you can use regular CDN, so you're really relying on the IP networks? How do you manage this?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. I think WebRTC was never built for scale. It was built for real-time communication, and I think that's one of the major things that's kept it from, I think, becoming the next replacement of Flash, and why still, I think there's a lot of skeptics out there still with that technology. But so scaling that is not trivial. And that's really us at our company, Millicast, and our parent company, Cosmo, that's our forte is WebRTC, and it has been for the last decade. So that's enabled us. You've seen some players come into the market and quickly exit because they've realized that the economies of scale don't quite quite work. I think the most compelling thing, before I talk about the actual IP network itself, is a lot of people hesitant to get into a flash replacement, because I think the CDN industry as a general rule has moved towards scaling HTTP resources, which is very cheap. It's serverless, it's just caching, and you can kind of throw resources at it and cache it very economically. I think a lot of vendors out there, they don't want to go back to an origin edge model that's very expensive to scale. Do we know if WebRTC is going to be around for a while, right? So there's all these things that I think there's a hesitation to get into that market. I think the most compelling thing that if I can tell the CDN vendors that are out there about whether they should get into this or not, is what WebRTC offers is an interactivity element that we don't get with HLS streaming, and we did kind of have with Flash, but it's even improved so with WebRTC. That interactivity we've seen from our customer base, we have an average of 40 cents per gigabyte is our average cost of our bandwidth all going across our network. When we have this race to zero that's happening with IP and networks, we're going down towards 2 cents and under 2 cents per gigabyte. It's kind of compelling that we now have a technology that can give us something that's 200x the price point, right? And eventually that will become a commodity as well. But I think between now and then, there's a lot of growth that's going to happen with these new kind of business models and new forms of consuming content and distributing content. I think is the most compelling argument about investing in a true replacement for this origin edge network. I think to answer the question specific about network, we do see issues. We do have the capability to scale to up to 1 million concurrent viewers on streams. I think it's one of the differentiating factors of our technology specifically. And we've seen, vendors in the industry. I don't want to point fingers or name names, but we have one particular customer in India who's doing a lot of remote classroom type workflows, and they were using a vendor and haven't been able to scale within the Indian ecosystem of their customer base. So obviously, there's a lot of IP providers that, both at the cloud layer as well as at the CDN layer, that I think need to help with being able to scale this through different networks to help with these kind of use cases in specific markets.
Okay, good. That's good. I mean, so it's still challenge in that regard. It's still challenging to get it done right. Basically, Guy. Emerging markets. You see APAC, Middle East, Latin, even Africa now are really seen as the growth hubs for IP networks in the future. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, especially also in what kind of, for instance, as you're a global player, geopolitical topics in those areas come to play, like, for instance, Hong Kong and Taiwan, etc. So how does this affect you as a global company in that regard?
We've seen over the last, let's say 10 years or so that the U.S. is quickly drifting from being the center of the internet to more of a regionally relevant market, which means that APAC and Europe, Africa, South America, they're all keeping their traffic local better than they had in the previous couple of decades. So yes, we've definitely seen, especially I just watched a panel with Africa where their goal was to try to keep 80% of their traffic local in Africa by 2020. I don't remember if they said that they hit it or not. I'm guessing probably not, but the goal is there, and so the eyeballs were always there, and so it's really bringing the content closer to the eyeballs. And something that we've seen very successful in South America. Europe I would say is already there. APAC is pretty close. South America, over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of additional players that came in and helped to localize the traffic there. Africa is probably the last frontier there, I would say. But to answer the second part of your question, the geopolitical issues are starting to raise their heads a little bit, and we have certain countries that either for a long time or just recently have started to chest beat a little bit and try to take a more active control over how the internet is deployed and used in their countries, in their borders. And yeah, I'm just going to kind of skirt the whole Hong Kong Taiwan issue. We're using the approach of just sort of wait and see, although certainly we've had discussions internally. I've had some discussions with some other companies that, operate there, all expressing some concern, and, everybody sort of is taking a wait and see approach to see what actually happens in those two particular markets. We haven't seen anybody pull out yet, but all kinds of contingency plans are being made.
Yeah. Okay. Nino, as being your infrastructure delivery, you also have IP networks that you use as well. Content distribution prices in general dropping 15-20% a year still. However, there's a trend now that IP distribution has basically overtaken regular TV distribution, right? Broadcast in general. So dependency on IP networks in general is getting higher. It's something that Gil already mentioned earlier. Can we expect at some point that the price to the bottom, let's put it that way, as Ryan mentioned it, is going to slow down because of the dependency on IP networks? What's your take on this?
It's a very interesting question, because as we see, and Guy mentioned, and everybody mentioned, actually prices on CDN are dropping. So there is a high rate, so like prices are coming down. And then there's a room for that, probably because of the technology of CDN can allow that. But there's another price, telecommunication prices, and telecommunication prices cannot go down with the same pace. So I don't know because there's no room technically for that to come down for telecommunications, and Guy can maybe help on that, or, as Ryan mentioned as well. So I think somewhere price will level up, I don't know, it's hard to say. But again, because of the telecommunication prices, it will be impossible to bring prices too much lower, in my opinion.
Yeah, it certainly has to level out at some point. We're not sure where that is. Every time we think that there's some sort of barrier or floor, next year it goes lower, and a lot of that has to do with new and adopting existing technologies in new ways, and then so that kind of lowers the floor for everything else. And so we have not seen where that floor is yet. We feel it has to be getting close, but
when is the big question?
When exactly? We don't know.
There's no indication yet in your end, at least.
We can continue to drive the pricing down by doing things like interconnecting with each other deeper, which was something that I went into more length on my presentation. Because what happens is, let's say I'll just use the US for an example, since that's the presentation I gave. We have 9 interconnection markets, major interconnection markets in the US, and what would happen is people from outside of those markets would have to build into one of those markets, or they feel like they would have to, in order to get that wholesale price that they need for to keep driving their costs down. And so what ended up happening is the access component of those circuits becomes a much larger and larger percentage as opposed to the overall package. And so having those deeper interconnection points and removing that access component out of it will actually help enable to continue driving the cost down. That's one of the takeaways that I had from my presentation.
I was going to add to that, Mark.
So there's room.
I think a big piece, as we talk about cost and price, it's very easy to focus, I think, and obviously I don't work for CDN, I don't know all the intricacies that go into Nino and Guy's job, and I'm definitely coming from more the customer side and seeing how not every megabyte is created equal. And I think that's something that we often forget is we've been stuck with protocols that are 20 plus years old. And with RTMP, the fact that we can't wrap in new next generation codecs means that we're restricted to a lot of the features that the industry is needing right now. Things like 10-bit and 12-bit, HDR, multi-point surround sound. These are advanced codecs that the world is asking for in a live real-time capacity for production, remote production, and all kinds of use cases. The fact that we need a protocol to what I'm getting at here is the fact that people are willing to pay for those features, what they're not willing to pay in the traditional model. So there's a huge opportunity, a market gap that I think I think the CDNs out there need to go and go, because the current path we're on is a path that's just going to diminish because we're still stuck in these original features, right? With what we're doing. The other piece too is that interactivity piece, like I mentioned previously, has a huge premium. People want to work in real time and they want to replace traditional satellite workflows and production workflows with these. I think that talking about a little bit of the regionality that we saw as well, I think the regional piece, there's two, I think, major things that are happening right now in broadcast. One is encryption. By going to a model where we don't actually have to use an origin server, some people are doing edge transcoding for the typical HLS workflows and skipping the need for an origin server, which brings the cost down on your production and so on. The second piece, which is even more compelling, is the next generation of codecs enable you to do scalable video coding, which means there is no need for an origin encode. It can all be done at the client. And this also means that we can encrypt content at the source and it doesn't get decrypted until the playback, which is this is going to help with security issues and making sure content is protected from point to point. Both those things are going to allow us to, once again, talking about the premium of what not every megabyte's created equal, those features are worth a ton of money to a lot of people. Think of the military and government use cases, enterprise, these Hollywood studios that I work with, they all care about their content truly being encrypted and not in the traditional origin to HLS model, which decrypts at the origin. So it's not true end-to-end encryption. I think those pieces are all quite compelling as well.
Ryan, last question, because I need to wrap up. I see the time. Ultra-low latency is still not widely supported by CDNs. You already mentioned this as yourself. So what can help on the IP side to really drive a bigger adoption of ultra-low latency? Is this really more on the client side, on the production side, use cases, or is there something we can do on the IP side to make it more easy to be able to get ultra-low latency adopted easier?
Yeah, so I'll make a very quick point here. So the biggest thing that's been lacking in WebRTC is a standard signaling protocol. So the reason RTMP became so ubiquitous is because a simple URI, and that's all you need to do the handshake in between one client and another, right? So that's with WebRTC, my CTO at my company, Sergio, is a big contributor to WebRTC as a standard, to the open source community. He has put to the IETF that's currently being reviewed a protocol called WIP, which is WHIP, WebRTC HTTP ingest protocol. Really what it does, it finally standardizes a signaling layer for WebRTC. That means a CDN or any vendor who's trying to build any encoder that's out there can just add WIP as an open source client, very, very easy to implement in different, whether it's JavaScript based or whether it's C++ based, whatever. And it just allows you to do that integration, and you do it once, and now you can push to every single CDN with that one standard protocol. So I think that is going to maybe create a lot of standardization around the use of WebRTC and make it logical for CDNs to start implementing it.
All right.
One thing I just wanted to throw on there too is that there are other things that can help with the ULL, such as like CTE, for example, chunk transfer encoding, something that we've been developing internally, or adopting internally, I should say. And there's a lot more information about that on our blog if you want to look for that. But very interested in that space too.
Perfect. Good. All right. Thank you all for the session, and I'm giving it back to Dom.
Can I ask Ryan a question? Because
yes,
you mentioned something. So Ryan, you mentioned about how RTMP has been around for a long time and doesn't have some of these codecs that people are asking for. And I'm not thinking just the video codecs, the audio codecs as well. One of the things the satellite industry did with its MPEG-2 transport was it figured out ways to embed in the payload things like MPEG-4, H.264. Do we expect there's going to be any innovation in RTMP going forward, or are we sort of stuck with what we're stuck with?
No, I think RTMP is dead in the water. I think it's a protocol that has ushered in this generation of video over IP, and we have to thank it for that. But just with the death of Flash and not being able to do point-to-point delivery with RTMP, it's still, I think it's going to still have a very relevant space in the contribution side of it, but obviously the distribution side of it, there's a huge gap that was left through the death of Flash. And I think ultimately that's going to be the last nail in the coffin for RTMP as a protocol. Yeah, there's just nothing being done to kind of add new codecs and new features at the pace that the industry needs it. And I think the one thing that WebRTC has got right is it's completely agnostic to the codec. It just doesn't care. It's just purely IP. Here's a media transport pipe. Put anything that you want inside of that, which has kind of been one of the things that people have wanted, is a little bit more standardization around WebRTC, because you can pretty much do whatever you want with it at the signaling, at the data, at the media transport layer. That standardization, especially for the broadcast industry, is I think a big evolution that I've seen at least over the last year or so.
Thank you for stepping in there, Tim. That was a perfect little jump in for me. Now, brilliant session. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Nino. Thanks, Guy. We'll see you a bit later on. If you've got any further questions, do dive into the chat room and find them in there to ask and continue the dialogue.